Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first webinar, which is part of a series of 3 webinars on issues from the Global South and the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Nammour and I'm speaking from Beirut, Lebanon. I'm a lawyer and researcher at the Beirut-based NGO and research center, The Legal Agenda. It's our pleasure to partner with the Justicia, an organization from Latin America, in this project and offer a series of webinars around the COVID-19 pandemic and human rights. We are thrilled to see many of you here from around the world for what looks like a really important and timely discussion. For our Spanish speakers, the webinar will be simultaneously broadcasted in Spanish on El Espectador. You can find the link on this YouTube video. Jessica, can you translate this to Spanish, please?
Hola a todos y todas. Para los hispanohablantes que nos están viendo en este momento, esta transmisión va a ser transmitida por El Espectador en un Facebook Live y pueden encontrar el link aquí abajo del video YouTube.
Thank you, Jessica. So why are we having this discussion today, and why is it important to talk about rights in the context of a public health crisis? The COVID-19 pandemic has been a test of societies, governments, and communities. The nature of the pandemic itself, requiring social distancing, has led to an inevitable limitations of many rights and liberties. And while in theory, exceptional limitations of human rights should only occur when there is no adequate alternative and in proportion to the risk, measures designed to hold the spread of the virus have revealed correlation between the fear of the pandemic and the surge in authoritarianism. Beyond public health concerns that arise out of the coronavirus, many countries of the Global South, the Middle East and North Africa included, continue to see a risk in the emergency measures becoming a foundation for greater consolidation of executive power, putting at risk liberties and freedom. Another alarming trend in this context and a source for great concerns is the enforcement of COVID-19 measures by police and military, leading to an overuse of policing and security powers to implement lockdown orders. This is particularly alarming in countries that were already under a state of emergency, such as Egypt. The current measures were a reminder of previous curfews imposed to suppress protests. We've seen an overuse of policing, and there was even a scandal of the police arresting doctors returning from their hospital duty by mistake. Similarly, in Jordan and Morocco, stringent restrictions have led to the arrest of thousands for breaching the curfews or for spreading false information. And if history has taught us anything, it is that the emergency measures enshrined through exceptional legal frameworks can quickly become normalized in environments of fear and the political exploitation of fear. And while the general tendency was to prohibit gatherings, many countries have overlooked those gathered coercively, such as prisoners. Moroccan prisons had been described as a coronavirus hotspot. Furthermore, and while the scale of the lockdown measures have left a heavy toll on the worldwide economy, in many countries of the Global South, the pandemic has struck at a precarious time of inequality. The impact of the virus has fallen most heavily on countries with weak social protection mechanisms, with the pandemic exacerbating an already frightful reality. Needless to say that the impact of this crisis on socioeconomic rights is unequal, with particular categories far more drastically affected by the lockdown, such as precarious workers, for example. Countries of the Global South, and namely countries like Lebanon and Venezuela, represented in this panel, had already been crippling with unprecedented economic crisis that this pandemic has intensified. This crisis has also been a reflection and a reminder of the socioeconomic choices made by governments in previous decades, exposing the unfitness of neoliberal policies and economies in dealing with a collective crisis and serving as a reminder of the need of the welfare state. Today, as we come to the realization that COVID-19 is probably the new normal, states are required to seek out alternatives to the extreme lockdown measures that are no longer sustainable. Our discussion today will be covering these challenges and will hopefully offer a reflection on what can be done to mitigate the inequality that seems to go hand in hand with the virus. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to welcome Santiago Arango, an artist who's joining us today. He will be creating a graphic summary of our conversation, which will compile the most important points discussed and will be available for download on the Justicia and Legal Agenda's social media pages right after the session. Thank you, Santiago. If he will show us first an empty image. I'm not sure if
Yes.
Santiago is connected now. Yeah.
I can share my screen. So this is a blank canvas, not as exciting right now, but it will, I promise. It will get exciting.
Great. We're looking forward to seeing the final version. So I'm also pleased to welcome with us three panelists. Calixto Ávila Rincon is a jurist and a human rights defender. He has extensive experience in several Latin American countries where he worked as part of NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and academic institutions. Since 1996, Calixto has been following the human rights situation in Venezuela. He is currently based in Belgium, working as an independent human rights advisor. He works at the Venezuelan Program of Action, Education, and Human Rights, PROVEA, as delegate in Europe, doing research and lobbying in European institutions and the UN human rights system in Geneva. Jessica Corredor is a researcher and is the director of the international area at the Justicia. She holds a PhD in sociology and anthropology from the University Paris 7. Her research work has focused on issues such as the construction of the state, social mobilizations, and more recently, the closing of civic spaces. Karim Nammour is a board member of the Legal Agenda, lawyer, legal researcher, and activist specialized in civil and socioeconomic rights, particularly policies and rights of persons who use drugs, LGBTIQ persons, labor and union rights, Palestinian refugee rights, housing, and urbanism. Each of the panelists will provide a brief presentation followed by questions. Please feel free to add your questions by commenting under the YouTube video. If you wish to write your question in Spanish, this is possible. Someone will be able to translate it for me. So we will start with Jessica, followed by Karim and Calixto. So please, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lama. Good morning here and good afternoon to you. Thank you for the introductions. I'm here to provide a global overview of the human rights situation in Latin America, but I think this is a very difficult task in such a short time. So I will focus on a couple of issues that I feel are important to highlight in this context. First of all, I think it's important to stress that Latin America right now is the epicenter of the pandemic, with over 800,000 cases. As of today, Brazil has almost reached 400,000 cases and registered over 25,000 deaths. Brazil is followed by Peru, Chile, and Mexico. And with regards to Colombia, we have over 24,000 cases and 800 deaths. However, certain experts have said that we haven't reached the peak of the pandemic, so we can expect that the worst is still to come. The second thing is that in the last couple of years, we've seen a rise of populist governments in Latin America, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and very recently Mexico with the election of López Obrador. The pandemic represents an opportunity for these governments to confirm and increase their power, as you already discussed it regarding the MENA region, Lama. But however, the imaginary threat that it's part of the populist government's playbook loses its relevance in this context and reveals their inability to deal with a real threat. This can have a tremendous impact for the region, as we have already seen. Mexico took quite a long time to react and to take measures to contain the pandemic. In Nicaragua, President Ortega was calling for massive demonstrations when the rest of the world was taking social distancing measures. And although the figures of cases of COVID are particularly low, several media have reported that hospitals are collapsing and that people are being buried in secret. For this reason, Costa Rica closed borders with this country 10 days ago, which will have severe economic consequences for Nicaragua, the second poorest country of the region. But I think that Brazil is the best example of how populist governments have been dealing with the pandemic, as Bolsonaro has not taken any coherent measures at the federal level. He contradicts what is recommended by the World Health Organization, and he keeps denying the magnitude of the health crisis, inviting his supporters to rally in the streets. 2 ministers of health have resigned in the last 2 months, while Brazil is the second country with the highest numbers of infections in the world. Human rights organizations have also stated that different government measures seek to lay the groundwork for a stronger system of government control once the crisis is over. So the health crisis has revealed the inability of populist governments to deal with the pandemic, but has also led other governments into taking an autocratic direction. For example, the government of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, he opted for punishments that have no scientific basis for reducing the spread of the virus, including captures for 30 days or more of those who leave their homes at the discretion of the police and the military. There have also been attacks against activists and journalists, and recently we've seen the president contradicting decisions of the Supreme Court. Another case that needs to be monitored is the case of the interim government of Yanin Álvarez in Bolivia, where the presidential elections, which were scheduled for May 3rd, were postponed. The Senate approved an election in 90 days, but the interim president contests the decision, and as she considers it unfeasible due to the pandemic. She also passed a decree that severely limited freedom of expression and access to information, and fortunately, that decree was repealed a month later. The different emergency measures taken by governments, which are necessary to contain the pandemic, have, like in most parts of the world, restricted rights and liberties. But I think that the real challenge is that these measures have presented several abuses, and we've seen how easily we as civil society accept those abuses because they give a sense that someone is in charge and make people feel safe. I think that fear is a very powerful weapon. In particular, freedom of expression and right to access to information have been breached. Several states, such as Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico, suspended or extended the processing deadlines for administrative procedures in general and or related to requests for public information. There have also been hundreds of arbitrary arrests and repression by law enforcement officers all over the Americas. And last but not least, there's the issue of digital surveillance. This is something that is quite new to us in Latin America, and I feel that we aren't really aware of the challenges it presents regarding privacy and personal data. Yuval Harari has talked about under-the-skin surveillance as one of the consequences of this pandemic. And the question is, how easily are we going to accept this? A Corona app has been developed in countries like Colombia and Chile. It is presented like an app which will save lives. But is technology really going to save us? In one of the main cities of Colombia, Medellin, the mayor launched the application stating that it gave the right to know if I was with someone who was infected. Is that really a right? And is that right more important than the lack of transparency about how the governments will use the data and the risks it presents for massive surveillance? I think here we're facing the classical dichotomy between security and democracy. It is also important to highlight the attacks on activists and HRDs. It is one issue of particular concern to the Justicia, the killings of HRDs and social justice leaders in Colombia and in the region. These killings have continued in the midst of the pandemic, as confinement measures makes it easier for the perpetrators to track their victims. Mexico, Honduras, Brazil, and of course Colombia are the countries where the defenders are most at risk. the magnitude of the pandemic has overshadowed other equally important issues, such as in Colombia, for example, the implementation of the peace agreement, which has been gradually undermined by the Duque government and which is directly linked to the assassination of social justice leaders. On the other side, one of the main challenges for the region, and you, Lama, stated it for the MENA region as well, are the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic in the most unequal region of the world. COVID-19 does not affect us all in the same way. It has not only revealed the dimension of this inequality, but it is affecting the most vulnerable sectors of the population, such as informal workers, migrants, refugees, among many others. It has also revealed the poor healthcare systems that we have, in particular in regions in the margins, like, for example, in the Amazon region, where the number of cases are exponentially growing, but the department in Colombia doesn't have any intensive care units, and the infrastructure is really precarious. So this situation is putting its population, which are mainly indigenous people, at very high risk. The necessary confinement measures have deeply affected the economy and will lead to austerity measures, which will inevitably deepen inequality. Before the pandemic, there was a wave of protests in Latin America contesting economic measures, corruption, and the neoliberal system in general. We can expect a great deal of turmoil after the pandemic, as protests in Ecuador have already begun against Moreno's economic measures. And I think that we as CSOs must be ready to monitor government responses to this in the context of the pandemic. Which takes me to the last point, and I'm sorry, I know I'm taking a bit longer than expected, but I wanted to highlight the real question and what does this crisis mean for our work as CSOs, and what is our role? I think this is an opportunity to stop working in silos, as the pandemic has also revealed how all rights are interconnected. We as CSOs working on different rights should definitely converge. Economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights working together with those who work on civil and political rights, but also CSOs that are working to bring humanitarian relief. That might allow us to connect issues on closure of civic space with the socioeconomic struggles. I think it's also an opportunity to build a compelling narrative around civil society and its value, which has been a big challenge, especially with the rise of populist and authoritarian regimes. And finally, we have an important role as CSOs to change the paradigm, and we have to act fast, especially because as lockdown measures are being lifted and eased, we are going back to business as usual, which is something that we simply cannot accept. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Jessica. Just building on your last point around our role as CSOs and civil society, I just like to mention that we will be discussing our own advocacy methods and advocacy tools in times of COVID during the last webinar, which would be in 2 weeks. I'll repeat the dates at the end of the session, but this is just a quick note. So thank you again for your presentation. I think you just summarized how in times of crisis, the natural impulse is to go to the extreme measures, either punitive or coercive measures. I can expect that Karim has a similar remark. So to you, Karim. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lama, and thank you, Jessica. I think there are similarities between Lebanon and well, the Arab world and Latin America are quite striking. So hello to everyone who is tuning in or is tuned in already, and to my fellow panelists. I hope you are all safe and sound in spite of the exceptional circumstances we are going through since the spread of the corona and to fight it in different countries around the world. I know that for most of us, these times are unprecedented. We have not been through this before, and we do not have to face such circumstances. It feels like our realities have mutated into one of those the coronavirus, and especially the measures taken to fight it, have had detrimental consequences on our way of life, on what we used to
We're having trouble.
Karim,
Karim, we're having trouble hearing you. If you could repeat just your last sentence, please.
where did it cut off exactly?
Your last sentence, exactly.
All right.
Just one sentence.
Okay, so I was basically saying that how the situation basically turned our lives into a dystopian nightmare. How our way of life was affected, how we used to, what we used to consider as safe spaces was affected, how the public space itself became a potential hazardous space, and thus mutated into a virtual realm where communication and serendipity are quite limited. Even our private space, and Jessica mentioned this, it's constantly invaded. Consequently, our mental health and our productivity were very negatively affected. On top of all of that, the situation has been especially exacerbated by the toll the measures taken to fight the coronavirus have had on the socioeconomic life and on socioeconomic rights. This has been particularly evident in a country like Lebanon, where its residents have been facing a historic economic and monetary collapse since at least a year ago, leading to a nationwide popular uprising on October 17th, 2019, which continues to this day and which I will go back to later on. In this intervention, I want to talk about how the Lebanese government responded to the coronavirus pandemic and the implications the measures taken to fight it have had on fundamental rights and freedoms. But I also want to talk on what we can do to limit these implications and overcome it. And we can do a lot. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Legal Agenda in Lebanon and the Justicia in Colombia for giving us this opportunity to talk about this issue within the Global South-South Dialogue series. I have already published many detailed articles on Legal Agenda's website on that issue, and you can all consult it there. Therefore, I will try to remain as brief as possible here, and we'll be able to go into more details later during the Q&A. So, what was the Lebanese government's response to the coronavirus pandemic? On March 15th, the government announced a general mobilization by decree. That decree stipulated a series of measures aimed at curbing the virus's spread, the most important being that citizens would stay in their homes except for utmost necessity. And I will go back to this term later. Congregations of all kinds in public and private places were banned, all air, sea, and land ports were closed, and public and private administrations and establishments were closed too. The Prime Minister's office then promptly issued a decision containing the instructions for applying the General Mobilization Decree, requiring security and municipal forces, so local authorities here in Lebanon, to apply the decree's provisions strictly and take immediate measures needed to prosecute people who do not respect it. Jessica mentioned something of that sort in Latin America. These measures seem to be in accordance with the global trend, right? And were even hailed for succeeding in containing the pandemic and limiting its spread by flattening the curve, as shown by preliminary studies. Nevertheless, the following observations can be made. First of all, neither the General Mobilization Decree nor its applicatory decision defines the concept of utmost necessity that allows residents to leave their homes without violating the self-isolation policy, leaving a broad leeway for interpreting this expression, which resulted or could result in abuse and corruption from the security forces entrusted with ensuring its application. In fact, it raised a lot of questions regarding what constitutes utmost necessity in this context. Is it limited to securing a person's subsistence needs, such as foodstuff, medicines, and going to the hospital? Or should it also include things that preserve one's psychological well-being? And we are all aware of the dire consequences confinement has had on mental health. These questions remained unanswered, and soon enough, the government, faced with difficulties to enforce this moral obligation of self-isolation, replaced it with imperative measures based on objective criterion like limiting circulation based on vehicles' plate number, whether even or uneven, and enforcing a de facto curfew at night. Secondly, the government vested regional and local authorities, as mentioned previously, with the power to immediately implement the measures without placing any controls on that power. Consequently, some of these authorities have gone as far as to take measures that isolate the town, sometimes fully from its surroundings, without any diagnosed COVID-19 cases inside it. In fact, the danger of granting local authorities in Lebanon, in particular, this power without placing clear control on it is that it totally ignores the inclination of some of them towards sectarianism and isolation for historical reasons in the country, under the pretext of limiting the epidemic, which has very dangerous repercussions on civil peace and coexistence. Thirdly, and this is the most thing, this is like the most dangerous thing, governmental measures reproduced punitive logic for confronting health crisis. They refer to articles of the penal code for prosecuting residents who violate the general mobilization decree. And listen to this, these articles punish whoever causes the spread of an infectious human disease. This is completely inappropriate because the legal conditions for it are not even met in this case. The penal code articles require that the perpetrator's action leads directly to the infection of other people, and certainly not just departure from the home in contravention of the isolation policy. The result of this is the inversion of criminal law principles, such as that the person is guilty until proven innocent, without a need for any social harm to arise from the act of leaving the home. In fact, the government went even further by encouraging its citizens to denounce whoever violates governmental measures. Now, this comes right out of a dystopian fiction, right? Where neighbors, siblings, friends start policing each other and denouncing each other accordingly. We end up with a culture constructed on fear of the other, fear of the neighbor, where citizens become the regime's agents and eyes everywhere, transforming the entire country into a huge prison in open space. Mind the oxymoron here, it shows how critically ludicrous the situation is. The entire situation was exacerbated by incredibly paternalizing discourses that came out from both the local media and the Minister of Interior, who did not hesitate to use a threatening tone while addressing the Lebanese people. The adoption of a punitive logic while combating the current epidemic betrays an effort to put punitive logic and strict application thereof before the logic of shared responsibility, which leads to greater constriction of personal freedom in this area. I must also mention that the adoption of punitive logic had a direct role in stigmatizing the disease and subsequently those struck by it. This issue is exacerbated further by the public and media fear-mongering over corona, which has reached the point where people who have gone out in public have been attacked by the media and by other people and described as, listen to this, brainless. Literally, this is the word that was used, brainless in news segments. This leads me to point number 4, the fear tactic. We cannot exclude fear in this context from its political role. Fear is a political tool, a very effective political tool, especially for a weakened regime. I'm going to go back a couple of months here to contextualize the situation in Lebanon. On October 17th, Lebanon saw a nationwide uprising against the political regime. The regime tried to unsuccessfully subdue these uprisings for months. In fact, the uprisings led to the fall of the former government in November. It blocked parliament from meeting many times, and it successfully blocked the adoptions of many laws that the regime was trying to pass. The current political regime's existence became critically threatened because of it. Then came Corona. People were afraid, and that state of fear became the perfect opportunity for the regime to re-establish itself in the public space. One of its first, be it symbolic, moves was to destroy the revolutionary tents in downtown Beirut under the pretext that Corona was spreading and public health needed protection. But the role of fear doesn't end here. Fear is also the ideal ingredient for what Naomi Klein theorizes as the shock doctrine. To make it brief, this doctrine explains how political and economic powers historically seized the opportunity of a shocking event like a natural catastrophe or war, etc., to lobby for the adoption of radical neoliberal policies that would have never been approved should that shocking event not have occurred. In fact, the reason why such events are ideal is because the people are in such a state of shock and fear that resistance to such policies become very low and weak. This is not a mere theoretical concept. In fact, it was coined by Milton Friedman himself, the economist who won the Nobel Prize, and first used by him in Chile with the rise of Augusto Pinochet before being used across the globe. The coronavirus isn't that different. In fact, Klein and her colleagues even started speaking of corona capitalism as a novel form of disaster capitalism within the shock doctrine framework. Indeed, we started seeing political and economic powers lobby for the adoption of such radical ideas in the past couple of weeks. To give a concrete example, let me just mention one example. What was proposed by former Minister of Telecommunications in Lebanon and current head of the Lebanese Economic Organization, Mohammed Sheikh. He proposed the use of employees end of service. Listen to this. He proposed the use of employees end of service indemnities to cover salary costs for the months of March and April 2020. Basically, stripping employees from their rights and retirement to alleviate the costs on employers. Other proposals included exempting big polluting companies from paying taxes, using depositors' monies to cover bank debts, etc. All radical ideas that no one would ever dare propose in normal circumstances. But circumstances today are anything but normal and people are afraid. So here you go, folks. I've shown how Corona was used to draw two novel architectures based on fear. The architecture of oppression and Corona capitalism. So what can we do to overcome this and draw an architecture of resistance ourselves within that context? In my opinion, resistance can follow a three-step protocol according to the following. Step one, keeping an eye on the regime's action, on all of the regime's actions. Just for the record, when I say regime, I mean the political and economic regime in general. The point here is to establish a continued critical view of the policies proposed and constantly deconstruct them and highlight their impact on public interest. This is basically our role here, the role of researchers, jurists, academics, activists, etc. Step two, propose alternative radical ideas as well. The shock doctrine works both ways. In fact, Naomi Klein, I mentioned her before, mentions one of Milton Friedman's letters to Augusto Pinochet, highlighting the importance of fast action in this situation. Because one of the biggest threats to the neoliberal regime here is that alternative leftist ideas are adopted first. Such ideas can cover a number of essential problematics that need special attention. For example, adopting a comprehensive housing policy that makes the staying at home motto one within the reach of everyone, not just the well-off social groups. This implies state intervention to control rent prices and establish ceilings for them, in keeping with the current situation for the sake of upholding the right to housing. Another example is adopting a comprehensive rescue plan to support the workers and wage earners who lost their jobs or whose wages have been cut or reduced by half. Another one would be adopting a rescue plan to support and protect the groups most vulnerable to the disease, such people placed or living in care homes or retirement homes. Here, I would also like to mention the messages I've received from our friends in Yemen, as special attention should also be given to countries in a state of armed conflict, where it is of paramount importance to decree a complete and credible ceasefire and an end to all attacks against civilians. Also, whether in Yemen or Lebanon or everywhere around the globe, adopting a penal policy is of paramount importance to reduce overcrowding in prisons, and Jessica mentioned this. So the point is to reduce overcrowding in prisons and jails, such that all detainees and persons convicted either for misdemeanors or petty or less serious crimes are immediately released, pursuant to the principle of risk mitigation. Step three is resistance per se. We've already seen this in Lebanon. After confinement, uprising mutated into a virtual online form, and later developed into alternative forms of demonstrations, like using private cars to block roads, etc. But it also went back to taking to the streets on multiple occasions in spite of confinement measures. I would like to end this intervention by reiterating two major key messages. The first is the imminent need to reconcile between economic and social rights on one hand and the preservation of public health on the other. The second is the dangers stemming from the fear and panic caused by the virus and the likelihood of it being misused or even exploited to impose measures that are incompatible with the concept of a democratic society committed to rights and freedoms and have negative effects that continue after COVID-19 disappears from our lives. I know the issue is not simple because of the fallacy produced by the panic that a choice must be made between the right to health, and Jessica mentioned the right to security on one hand, and economic and social rights on the other. We may rush into instinctively choosing the right to health or security as it extends directly from the right to life. But remember this, in this false dilemma, both choices lead to the same practical result. We end up choosing a means of death before more than a path of life and sustainability. It has never been more critical and crucial today to remain alert and avoid falling in the shock doctrine trap. Instead, we need to remain aware that the doctrine works both ways. Therefore, it is of paramount importance that we use it ourselves against the regime itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karim. Just to be on time, I'm sorry, I have to say this, but Calixto, please, if you can stick to 10 minutes, because just to open the discussion and benefit from the discussion and from the questions. So to you, Calixto.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to explain and to share with you the situation in Venezuela. Also, I want to underline that solidarity between people in Colombia and Lebanon is very important because we are almost facing the consequences of regional situation, and we are also giving answer to these necessities for the population. So I'm going to share with you the screen here, my screen, in order to do my intervention. Just a moment, please. Okay. Yeah, Venezuela is living a complex humanitarian emergency. It's an emergency that is starting several years ago. It's not a new situation, it's something growing. Even assuming the best case scenario in the management of the health crisis aggravated by COVID-19, the Venezuelan situation could be even worse than we have known so far. This is clear from the recent global report on food crisis 2020 by the World Food Programme. Venezuela, the country with the largest oil reserve in the world, and which received the equivalent of 10 Marshall Plans from export between 1999 and 2019, faced the fourth worst food crisis in the world in 2019. The list is made up of Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, Sudan, Nigeria, and Haiti. Before the arrival of COVID-19, Venezuela was living already a complex humanitarian emergency. More than 40% of the more than 5 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants remained in the region, often in Latin America and Caribbean countries. 7 million of people need humanitarian assistance that is around 25% of the population of Venezuela inside the country. During the last year, hospitals are reporting a shortage in medical supplies, protective equipment, and medicines. An important number of doctors, nurses, and special care workers have migrated. Currently, Venezuela healthcare infrastructure is so weak that the most basic recommendation, hand washing, is difficult even for healthcare providers who work under difficult conditions. And also public hospitals in Caracas are also suffering regular water shortage. In remote hospitals, the shortage have lasted weeks to months. Imagine what will happen to health workers and patients if COVID-19 continues progressing in Venezuela, where is no capacity to complex care due to the lack of intensive care beds. We have to add the dramatic collapse of public service with shortage of water, gas, and the slowest internet in Latin America. And on top of that, Venezuela is suffering a shortage of fuel, despite having the world's largest reserve of oil in the world. But what is the answer of Maduro governments to the COVID-19? The current circumstance means that the two tools of resistance to the authoritarian of Maduro government are seriously compromised. The first one is the social mobilization, because it's not longer possible because of the lockdown measures. The second one is the attention of the international community that could be seriously reduced due to the impact of the pandemic in the world. The current situation is the ideal situation for the government, for the de facto government to control the population and to consolidate the power. The de facto government has continued to the political persecution without regard the seriousness of the COVID-19 pandemic, not only against political opponents, deputies, union leaders, etc., but also health workers, doctors, agricultural workers, journalists, and even ordinary citizens. In many cases, they are accused of alleged crime committed in the law against hate, an instrument that is often used against political opponents under the doctrine of the internal enemy, but currently persecutes health workers and journalists. You can see there some figures on the policy of the state of the government in Venezuela, especially the impact in civil rights, civil human rights, that is traduced is applied to attacks against populations, to arrestation, and also to murder of two people during the last 2 months. Well, but what is the situation of human rights defenders in Venezuela? Concerning human rights defenders, a recent and comprehensive analysis done by 5 NGOs entitled The Internal Enemies conclude that in Venezuela, human rights defenders and organizations are defined as internal enemies. And a complex state policy uses public institutions to defame and harass them. This report documents a total of 121 attacks, including 60 attacks of defamation, 44 attacks of harassment and stigmatization, as well as 8 cases of arbitrary detention against human rights defenders and organizations during the period of 2018 to 2019. On the other hand, legislation has been arbitrarily restricting the autonomy of NGOs. In 2012, the law on the defense of political sovereignty and national self-determination was enacted with the purpose to apply sanctions against organizations and receive financial contributions from individual and foreign organizations. More recently, members of the de facto government have announced the adoptions once the social quarantine will be over, to allow to control international cooperation and to apply even criminal sanctions to people from NGOs. Venezuela is living a complex humanitarian emergency before the arrival of COVID-19. The defense of human rights remains a priority for human rights organizations. It also concerns the recovery of the democracy in Venezuela due to the essential link between human rights and democracy. Today, When the coronavirus pandemic puts the lives of millions of people worldwide at risk, actors of political conflict in Venezuela try to manage the outbreak separately, without paying attention to the clamor of millions of Venezuelans who face the challenge of COVID-19 in the middle of a complex humanitarian emergency with profound deterioration in health system, food security, and precarious access to water, electricity, gas, internet, fuel, and employment. What is the proposition that we are to conclude this exposition? What are the propositions that we want to underline? And is we are looking here this dramatic picture in Venezuela, in which it's you can see people trying to provide themselves with water because the lack of drinking water in Venezuela. So what are these 6 propositions that we are underlining this to solve, to face the situation in Venezuela? The first one is ensuring the arrival of resources and supplies from the international community. The second one is easing or suspending the international sectoral sanctions as requested by the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. The next one is focusing on the most vulnerable population, older adults, chronically ill, rural and indigenous population in remote areas. The next one is allowing the visit of two specific agencies of the United Nations, the United Nations World Food Program and the United Food and Agricultural Organization. And the next recommendation is to guarantee the access to food. And the last one is giving primacy to scientific and epidemiological knowledge over political interest. So thank you very much for all your attention, and I remain with you for any questions. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Calixto, for this insightful presentation, highlighting a grim reality, unfortunately, in Venezuela. I would like to remind our viewers that they can type their questions under the YouTube video in English or in Spanish. I'd like us to open a bit the discussion, and building on Calixto's and Karim's presentations, I would like us to delve a bit deeper in the effect or the impact of the economic crisis, especially in countries of the global south. So many of these countries were unable to implement the kind of monetary and fiscal stimulus measures that we've seen in other countries. So, for example, in Lebanon and in the Middle East, in countries such as Egypt and Palestine, we've seen a pattern for the call for donations and establishing donation and service funds with a very negligible intervention of the state in the social welfare. So my question is to Calixto and Karim, how can we talk about socioeconomic rights in a context of economic collapse? What are the particular dynamics here, and what can be done? So Karim, I know you've touched on this during your presentation, but I would like to discuss it a bit more in light of also the Venezuelan experience. So would you like to start, Karim?
Yes, sure. So you've already mentioned that Lama, what we've seen here in Lebanon, the problem is that one needs to contextualize a little bit to make it a little bit more clear, and go back to the sectarian and political nature of the Lebanese regime. What we've seen in terms of calls for donations is basically politicians and very rich men or owners of very corrupt companies basically donating so much money as a form to basically clear up their tarnished image, an image that was tarnished basically, especially after the October 17th uprising. So here again, we see how Corona was used as a tool, a political tool for this political elite, for the regime, to basically try to reestablish itself in the public space. But it wasn't really taken lightly by the Lebanese population, who were very highly critical of this trend to basically donate money. To answer the other part of your question regarding how can we speak about economic rights, socioeconomic rights in this context, actually, again, I go back a little bit to my presentation and to the concept of the shock doctrine. I think the situation is also ideal to speak about those rights for a very basic reason, is that right now the Corona basically showed all the failures of the neoliberal regime that we have been living in for the past 30 years. I mean, we've known this, but the Corona crisis basically maximized how much of a failed regime this is, and people who didn't necessarily question this regime before started questioning it. And this is where it's ideal to speak about socioeconomic rights. Because I mentioned before in my presentation, when I spoke about the shock doctrine, how it is an ideal situation to basically propose radical ideas that would have never been proposed outside this context. And this is what basically neoliberal powers do. And this is what they've done historically. But it works both ways. And this is where we can also propose alternative radical ideas that re-question the very fundamental pillars of the neoliberal regime. And I think it is an occasion to actually overcome this regime and start building a new one that is much more inclined to public interest and to social justice.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Venezuela is, as I explained, living a complex humanitarian emergency. We have a situation that is already in the country for several years ago. Venezuela has the highest inflation in the world. The amount of the monthly amount of a salary in Venezuela is $3 per month. We are in a situation where we receive a high income for exportation, as explained in the past. And despite this fact, the fact that we receive this money currently, we are in a country facing a very critical economical situation. So this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is arriving at a moment where the country is already facing a critical situation in economical terms. So the only exit currently, and of course, the solution is a change in the political regime in Venezuela. That is clear. But for the moment, the urgent situation is saving life in Venezuela. That's why, for instance, this week in Brussels, we had a conference, a donor conference, and they set an important amount of money to people, to refugees and people migrating from Venezuela and inside Venezuela. It's an amount of $2,500 million. So it's an important amount. Why we need this money in a country who had the largest reserve in petrol in the world? So there is a responsibility before that happened, where the corruption in the country is one of the explanations. What we are facing is the situation is because the corruption is very, very consolidated in the country, and the impunity also is one of the parts, because nobody is sanctioned for this. For the crimes, in terms of who commit crimes in order to take the money that the state received in the past. So it's very difficult to restart even the economic impact, for instance, for the CEPAL, who is one of the regional intergovernmental organization, is placing Venezuela the most critical country for the post-pandemic periods. So we will be one of the poorest country in the world because of the impact of the COVID-19. But the responsibility are from before the pandemic, and also the government is trying to point out the economical sanction that, of course, we as human rights organization, we don't agree with these economical sanctions, the unilateral sanction, for instance, from the United States. But this is something that arrived after 2018. But before, during the high prices of the oil in the world, we received a lot of amount of money. So where are those responsibilities? So it's something that is really to take in consideration how to bring the people responsible of these crimes before the justice, and it's not something that will be happening inside the country, because unfortunately in Venezuela there are no independence of the judicial power, and neither of the other powers of the state. So there is a lack of democracy. So it's really challenging to bring these people before the justice.
Great. So I think you just proved what Jessica was saying about how rights are intertwined. So the idea of independence of justice is really related to socioeconomic rights and accountability and the protection of the most vulnerable. I want to go back to what Karim was saying about the limits or the failure of neoliberal policies and the neoliberal regime, and the protests and the context of the protests that we've seen in Lebanon, but we've also seen in Colombia before the COVID crisis. And Jessica, would like to hear a bit from you about this aspect. So can we delve a bit deeper on how did these protests, how were they affected by the COVID measures, and were there any alternative ways or alternative tools of protesting? But also, how do you think this crisis and what it has shown about our regimes, do you think it will add new layers of mobilizations or new layers to protests in the future?
Yes, thank you, Lama, for the question. So as I briefly presented it in my presentation, before the arrival of the pandemic in Latin America, and especially at the end of 2019, we were having a series, we were part of this global wave of protests in Latin America. And as I said, they were really turned to demands on the economic measures, the neoliberal system, etc., etc. Let's say that it's not because of coronavirus then that these different protests stopped. They were already kind of calming down progressively, and especially because certain small demands had been heard by the different governments. I know that in Ecuador, the government went back on the different measures that they had exposed and that launched the mobilizations. And in Chile, well, there's a whole constitutional process that is now going on. But I think that that the momentum wasn't really lost, and that now with the pandemic, I think we do have new layers to this social turmoil. We've seen, and for example, so I mentioned Ecuador, where protests already started again despite the confinement measures, but I know that recently there were also protests in Chile, and the same as in Colombia, because people who cannot stay home are struggling to just have something to eat. So as I was saying, I think we must really be prepared, because what we were having before at the end of 2019, let's say that light has not been turned off. And on the contrary, I think it's going to be like really intensified by the crisis, the economic crisis that we are already experiencing, and the measures that are going to be taken by governments. In Colombia, what we saw was this spontaneous form of mobilization, which was people putting red flags outside of their houses, which indicated that they didn't have anything to eat. And I think that may be a positive, if we can say that, aspect of this crisis is that solidarity. There have been like a lot of demonstrations of solidarity. And I think that we should definitely build on that as well.
So Jessica, you actually laid the ground for my next question on solidarity. So obviously, as you said, the response to this crisis in Colombia and elsewhere required solidarity, cooperation, and actually a collective response. And the pandemic itself, the nature of the pandemic has revealed the limits of individual responses or individualistic responses. And one of the primary critiques to the discourse of rights and to the discourse of human rights is that it overemphasizes ideas of autonomy and ideas of individualism. So my question here is to all the panelists, actually, do you think we have an opportunity here to kind of rethink our human rights regime, to focus less on individualism and autonomy and more on our collective vulnerabilities and our collective actions? So is it really, can we say that this is an opportunity to rethink the role or the impact of individualism in our societies and the ideals of autonomy and their limits, actually?
Should I go first?
Go ahead.
I saw you smiling there while saying this, because I think you know how much of a sensitive issue this is for me. Yes, the autonomy of will and individualism and law has started being criticized in the last couple of years. I know, and I know that you went through this as well. When we studied law, autonomy and individualism to a certain degree were sacralized as concepts that should not be re-questioned at all. And in the last couple of years, with the, I think it started mostly after 2008, the first worldwide economic collapse. The autonomy of will started being re-questioned as a sacralized concept of law, integrating a lot of socio-economic external factors to are individuals really autonomous when making a legal decision or signing a contract, etc. And this has been emphasized even more after the last economic collapse that you are still going through in Lebanon today. And I do believe that it is a unique opportunity to re-question those sacralized concepts, even like neoliberalism, because let's remember a little bit that the autonomy, the concept of autonomy of will that was basically concocted by Kant in the 18th century was later developed and completely taken out of context to basically develop capitalistic theories and later on neoliberal theories, taken to such an extreme where basically the individual is stripped from all state protection and social protection and left on their own. Again, the corona crisis, the corona pandemic crisis showed all the failures of this regime. When I say regime, I mean the neoliberal concepts of individuality, of autonomy, etc. And I think it's an ideal and unique opportunity to re-question all of this and rethink what is an individual in a society today, given the economic, social, and health context. I don't think individuality will survive this. I don't think it should. I think one of the main reasons why we reached that point in terms of economic collapse in Lebanon was, one of them was the sacralization of autonomy and individualism. And I think that the corona pandemic is a unique opportunity to re-question all of this.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that it's a very interesting question. I mean, what are the conditions that a society needs to explain solidarity, to show solidarity to the others? Because, of course, individuality, I think in a way, authoritarian regimes are trying to get people more individual. If you see the situation in Venezuela, for instance, if you want to explain something like the expression of solidarity in Colombia, the first thing that you need is having the capacity to bring something. But in the situation in Venezuela, people are used, the shortage provide the shortage of food, the shortage of medicines, put people in such a vulnerable situation that they are not able to share. And even in despite of that, I think we can see some expression of solidarity in Venezuela. So that shows you the quality of people in Venezuela, the human quality of people in Venezuela, even in this condition. This is the first point. The second point is we are convinced that the government is really taking the opportunity to pressure against, to put more pressure again, or the social and political opposition. So it's a very good opportunity because people are locked down in their homes. The control in the street are more strong. And when people, and despite of that, and in despite of that, people are really doing a demonstration in the streets because the lack of water, the lack of food, and it's impossible to remain at home. People prefer to go to the street and to go to break the social distance and just ask for their rights. So, but at the same time, it's a very good opportunity for an authoritarian regime, and we are seeing that in Venezuela, where the colectivos that are paramilitary structures that can control population, that know some people, and they create a system, an important system to control and to be present during the manifestation and to control during the demonstration and to control people directly, treating people and so on. Not only by using paramilitary structure, but also by using the police. For instance, in Colombia, we have the FAES. The FAES is a special body of the national police. We consider this as a squad death, you know, because they are arriving with their faces covered with guns, and they treat people taking part in demonstration. And it's not a body of the police created for that. It's a special operations squad, a special operations body. And it's used to control people doing manifestation. And this is really creating a situation of panic, a situation of fear in the population. And I think this kind of collective answer is facing in authoritarian regime really a very challenging situation, because it's at the end, it's a matter of survival. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica, would you like to answer this, or should we go to another question?
I think we can definitely go to another question because Karim and Calixto already responded.
Okay. So just as a quick note, we're receiving many questions. I just want to say that on June 4th, we will be discussing issues of migration and COVID-19. And on June 11th, there are 2 consecutive Thursdays, we will be discussing advocacy and strategic litigation in light of COVID-19. So we are receiving many questions about migration and questions about the role of civil societies. I will not ask them now, and I will keep it for the next webinars. Jessica, we have a question actually from Colombia, and it's about what can be done in the Amazonas. It's a department, the person says it's a department that has seen a lack of state presence since forever. So what can be done when the state is not there? What are the alternatives?
So yes, I mean the Amazon region, and not only in Colombia, but is like a matter of great concern. As I mean, the World Health Organization has already said their concern about this particular region. I think that it is very complicated, as those are regions which are at the margins of the state. But I mean, we from the Justicia, we have stated like a several number of measures that could be taken during this pandemic. We cannot solve the absence or failure of the state in this kind of regions right now, but we can suggest several different measures. I think that the first one is that we need to take into account the fact that most of the population of the Amazon region is indigenous, as I already said. So we need that the data that we have regarding infections and deaths to be disaggregated so that we can take particular protective measures for the different groups, different population groups. The other one is that we proposed fiscal measures so that indigenous authorities can adopt also their own medical measures with the intercultural perspective, and that they coordinate this with the state. And I think that another one is that since these regions are very far from anything, so we need to, for the Minister of Health to provide air and water transport, from these regions, because people have had to be transferred from the main hospital of the Amazon, Leticia, to other parts of the country since the infrastructure is so poor. And last but not least, I think it's important to have a coordinated strategy between the countries that share the border, which is Peru, Brazil, and Colombia.
Great, thank you. So we have another question around the companies actually, and the idea of donations. So one question is that these companies mentioned by Karim are in many Latin American countries, Colombia, Lebanon, Venezuela. What are the strategies you are looking to deal with this type of financial contributions linked to extractive companies or organized crime? So this goes back to the idea of donating certain powerful entities, donating money to kind of expunge their crimes. So how do we deal with this? And just to add one point, that in Lebanon, many people were saying that stop criticizing people who are donating because we need the money. So how do you deal with this discourse? How do you say, how do you rationalize, or how do you critique, or how do you advocate against such donations? Karim, would you like to answer this?
Well, you begin by deconstructing the discourse. I mean, it's very easy to work on an image. It's much harder to deconstruct it, but you already start with there, and this is basically what we've done here successfully, because it's true, we did listen to the major argument was that why are you criticizing them? Yes, but at the same time, these same companies and these same people were violating public property in Lebanon, and you've worked on that yourself. I mean, you know that they were violating the seashore, public spaces, without paying any contribution, without paying taxes, without paying penalties. And if they did pay either taxes or penalties or anything to the government, it would have been 10 or 20 times bigger than the donations they're giving. So this is the most important strategy, is to deconstruct the discourse of these people and actually remind the population at large of their misdoings, what they've done, how did they reach that level of capital, basically, where did the money come from? And in most of the cases, I mean, I'm not going to say all of them, but definitely like easily 90% of them, we are speaking about people who violated public space, who profited from a very corrupt system to basically either not pay taxes or pay very little amounts of money, and counterparts make a lot of profit out of it. So no, donations are actually a joke. They're not something that we don't need that money. We need the money we need is the money of the stolen public properties. This is the money we need. We need the taxes that needed to be paid and were not. We needed the penalties that needed to be paid and were not. This is the money. Donations are basically a bribery, no more nor less.
Okay.
The strategy is to deconstruct that discourse.
Okay, so we're running short on time. I will just add a few questions. This one is to Calixto. Could she, no, what is it? In Venezuela, there are no conditions for people to survive in isolation, but neither are the conditions for the health system to be able to assist them. What should be done? So I think this is a question that kind of wraps up all our discussion. What can we do now? So Calixto, this question is to you.
Yeah, of course. I have said that the situation in Venezuela depends currently on international solidarity to solve this kind of situation. It's not, there is no capacity inside, even not for private, for the private sector who have been destroyed in Venezuela. So we don't have any possibility to have donation from this side, for instance. So the answer currently is in the hands of international assistance from the, I told you about this important amount of money that is important, but at the same time is not enough to solve the situation inside in Venezuela. And a part of this donation that the European Union and other countries have commit this week here in Brussels, a part of this money is going to invest inside of Venezuela, not only outside of Venezuela, but inside Venezuela. An important sector is the health system, and the health system is there is already a lot of organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières and other international organizations specialized in the matter of health. So I think this is a part of the question, and the other part is what people can do inside Venezuela with their capacity that still remains. We have doctors in Venezuela, hospitals also, and doctors are fighting since several years ago because the condition of the hospital are really, really critical. So I think this kind of is not an easy answer for a country that is collapsing. So, and the only way that we have is international solidarity. And we are convinced that if we don't take immediate steps to solve the situation, and if we don't arrive to humanitarian agreements inside the country at the level of the political actors, the situation in Venezuela could be very, very dramatic in the next months. Not a matter of years, it's a matter of months, really. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will ask one last question to Jessica, actually, and it's actually because it's the topic that is a bit dear to my heart. So many countries have adopted the policy of shielding the vulnerable, which is basically asking the elderly or those with underlying health conditions or the disabled to isolate or to stay at home. And so basically the response to COVID is to isolate those that are the most vulnerable. Jessica, do you think this is, from a human rights perspective, how do you think this is problematic? And where would you place it in a human rights-based approach? And how do you think, actually this should lead us to re-question the meaning of vulnerability and how we treat vulnerable populations? So, Jessica.
Yes, well, thank you, Lama. And as you said, yes, in Latin America, we've adopted several measures to protect the most vulnerable. And when we say vulnerable, we're talking in terms of age as well. So in Colombia, people over 70 years old are under strict confinement measures since almost the end of March, and those measures have just recently been extended. So I think it poses a certain number of issues, in particular, for example, for these elderly people who live by themselves, for example, or many of those who were informal workers and needed to go out to earn their own living. So I think it does pose a certain number of questions, because you cannot take this kind of measures if you cannot assure, for example, income or care for these people. These are people who might be sick, who might be in need of medicine, and who, if they live by themselves, need to go out. So from a human rights perspective, I think more than just talking about the vulnerable in particular, I think in here I'm going to quote our founding member, Rodrigo Primi. I think that to be able to take this kind of measures that protect the most vulnerable, and when I say the most vulnerable, I mean really all vulnerable population, I think is through redistributive measures that really transfer resources from the richest to the poorest. I think that redistribution reduces that tension between the need to protect public health in order to avoid deaths from COVID and the need to protect the economy and income to avoid deaths that are battered by poverty.
Great. I think we can all agree with your suggestion, and I think now is the time we've all been waiting for, to see Santiago's piece of art. So Santiago, I'm not sure if you're ready to show us the drawing.
Yeah, I am. Well, it's work in progress, but what I wanted to show is just what you guys said, and a lot of the things in common that we are living and that we're going through, and that's very interesting because it happens in both of our. We all share the same region, so it's very interesting for me to see like what sort of things you said is going on, are going on. Sorry. So the first thing is what's happening, and that confinement, even though it's necessary, well, it's been used as an advantage point for governments, both in our countries and your countries. It has shown a precarious health system, and isolation has become a tool for oppression. We have seen it by police force, by the impossibility of mobilization, the digital vigilance, and of course, unclear policies with a punitive logic. And what it translates, I think, the most important thing you said, and what I wanted to focus on, it's fear, because even though and fear feeds, I think, from all of this, from isolation, from vigilance, from a stalled economy, and all the situations we're going through. But what I'm working on, and it's not finished yet, but I will show you when it's finished and when it's done, is that you guys all stood on a common point that I think it's amazing, and that solidarity is definitely the way to go. And what can we do is just base ourselves and on a solidarity standpoint, I think, and also trying to be more united and fight against what governments are trying to lay on us, and whatever injustice and unfairness we see happening to each other and the people around us. So that's the way I think to fight fear. That's where I want to go to.
Thank you, Santiago. And on this positive note, I think it's time to end this webinar. Thank you so much to all our panelists. It's always a pleasure to cooperate with the Justicia, and I hope that our audience will also follow the next webinars. So thank you everyone, to those who watched and to those who participated in the panel, and stay safe.